The Invention of Women. What in God's name is that all about? So, Oyeronke Oyewumi, as you can tell by the name, she's Nigerian. She's a Yoruba professor of various different things, and obviously very, very philosophical sister. And this first chapter that we're going to look at, the first chapter we're going to look at in the book is called "Visualizing the Body: Western Theories and African Subjects." That's the name of this chapter that we're going to kind of focus on in this book. And her this chapter lays out what the main theoretical foundations of her argument are. What her argument is, this chapter sets out what her main argument is with regard to gender, with regard to the West, with regard to other parts of the world. And also, it starts a little bit to get into, giving some evidence to justify her arguments. And right from the beginning, on page 1, she gets right into it. She says, in tracing the genealogy, the first main point that she says, she argues, is that in Western thought, biology equals destiny, i.e., whatever people turn out to be in life is said to be, or whatever people's social roles are, whatever people's functions in society are, their place in a society, all of those things are basically grounded in biology, or I should say grounded in perceptions of biology, because she makes a point about this later, which confuses me a little bit, but her point, the main point is that biology in the West is seen as destiny. So she says on page 1, page Moja, trying to start using more African languages, Moja. She says, in tracing the genealogy of the idea of degeneration in European thought, J. Edward Chamberlain and Sander Gilman noted the way they noted the way it was used to define certain kinds of difference in the 19th century in particular. And then she quotes from this text. Initially, degeneration brought together two notions of difference. One, scientific, that is a deviation from an original type, and the other, moral, a deviation from a norm of behavior. But they were essentially the same notion of a fall from grace, a deviation from the original type. Consequently, those in positions of power find it imperative to establish their superior biology as a way of affirming their privilege and dominance over others, quote unquote, others. Sorry, this is Oyewumi speaking now. Those who are different are seen as genetically inferior, and this in turn is used to account for their disadvantaged social positions. Okay, hopefully that isn't going to be anything new for anyone who has spent even more than a few months thinking about the situation of Black people in this world, particularly in the West, in the West, in the UK, US, and so forth. Because what do we hear from these racists? What do we hear from these supporters of white supremacy and these purveyors of these priests of anti-Blackness, whether you want to call them people like Stefan Molyneux is one, who else? Jared Taylor is another. There's many of them. I mean, flipping heck, what's the guy's name? Boris Johnson here in the UK. These people will talk about scientific racism. I mean, they won't use that term, but they will spout from their cesspools of mouths scientific racism, meaning they want to say, oh yeah, Black people. The thing with Black people is that they have lower IQ, and that lower IQ is genetically determined. So that's why they're at the bottom of the society everywhere. It's just in the body. It's just in the genes. It's just in here. The physical body is what's at problem here. You can look at things like, exactly, yeah, the bell curve is a good example. Charles Murray, who's still spouting this stuff, to this day, the bell curve rhetoric that, Black people are just genetically inferior, or they don't tend to say inferior anymore, but they'll couch it in language like they just have lower IQ genetically. And so Charles Murray says, the thing is, it just means that some of the social interventions that we're doing, it's silly because it's not going to deal with this genetic difference, you know. So basically, it's like they use, and that's the point that she's making there, is that they use things like this, you know, these beliefs, these doctrines of theirs about the genetic biological alleged inferiority of black people to justify things like racial profiling, racist AI, you know, racist hiring practices, racism, anti-blackness, full stop. So Oyewumi is saying is zeroing in on that and saying, yeah, look, in the West, biology is destiny. And then on page 2, she goes on to say that as a result of this belief, this foundational concept in Western thought, the body thus becomes, this is a quote, by the way, the body becomes a text, a system of signs to be deciphered, read, and read into. Social law is incarnated. In other words, social law is, you know, is directed and targeted at bodies. It's corporealized. Correlatively, bodies are textualized, read by others as expressive of a subject's psychic interior. So the body is there to be read, you know, and the body is like a text, it's like a book, is, you know, I'm just as much, this is just as much, my, you know, my physicality is just as much of a book in Western thought as this is a book, you know, in Western thought, she's saying. And in Western thought, she's saying that, you know, this is how people are evaluated, and you know, their social position is determined based on their bodies. And something that I just thought about here on the basis of that is, it just made me think a little bit about the modern zeitgeist, whatever, of the Instagram era. You know, this whole era that we're living in now, where, you know, we're surrounded by you know, social media and all that kind of stuff. And it made me think about our sisters in particular, brothers as well, but particularly the you know, the women who are on Instagram constantly, like, you know, getting their lips all mash up, and the stuff done to their cheeks and backsides, and, you know, I don't know, BBLs, big, you know, all that sort of stuff that that's going on, all that ever invasive cosmetic surgeries. You see a lot of women, for example, more and more women anyway, going to Turkey. Probably not so much right now due to that devastation that's taking place over there, but they go there because it's cheap. I was in London the other day, and on the tube, and I saw an advert saying, "Oh, come and get our cheap cosmetic surgery in Turkey." I thought, wow, okay, yeah. So this is, and the reason I bring that up is because what Oyewumi says here with regard to the West's centering of the body and as a text to be read makes me think, what is it about? It makes me think that, are these sisters and men in different ways, they're so desperate. It seems like they're so desperate to present a certain image of themselves, so desperate that they'll go and spend thousands and thousands of pounds to tweak and, you know, change their physical look. Is that something to do with the fact that they determine their inner sense of worth and, well, you know, their sense of who they are and the value of who they are based on their outward appearance? I think so, to be honest. I think that is potentially a bit of a manifestation of what Oyewumi is talking about here. So, you know, what modern Western thought is all about, you know, society is determined by biology. You know, social roles are rooted in biological concepts, and the body becomes a text to be read. Then she goes on to say, this next bit is probably my favorite, or one of the most interesting things that she says in this chapter, which is that she goes on to argue that Western thought perceives the reason for what I've just talked about, the reason the West thinks in this way and focuses so much on the body, is because the West perceives the world primarily by sight, by vision. And she said that this is different. This is not the same in other cultures. So this is what we're getting into here, is epistemology. You know, we're getting into epistemology here, which is how the epistemology is a fancy Western, fancy Greek word, I think, or based on Greek terms. A fancy term which is all about knowledge, the study of knowledge. How do we learn? How can we know what we're learning? How do we know what we know? You know, what are the ways that we can learn? What are the ways that we can know and obtain knowledge? And for Oyewumi, Western epistemology walks by sight, whereas other cultures, including the Yoruba, do not walk by sight. They do not judge people based on what they look like. So, yes, Tito District said Instagram is causing serious issues of depression with young women because of the focus on image and beauty. Absolutely. And it's crushing. It's a crushing, you know. One thing I thought to myself earlier was that I wonder how many images the average teenager looks at in their life, or in a day, let's just say, the average images that they must look like, and compare it to the average number of images that I probably looked at in my teens, you know, or the average number of images. There's so much, there's just overflow, bombardment of images. And unfortunately, the manifestation or the implication or the result of that are these depressions and so forth that we get. Hang-ups, you know, and various other mental imbalances based on this whole thing coming out of the Western, you know, epistemology of everything is about sight. So, quote from page 2 going into page 3, really powerful quote, which I'm going to read. One of many very powerful quotes. So, Oyewumi says this: the reason that the body has so much presence in the West is that the world is primarily perceived by sight. The differentiation of human bodies in terms of sex, skin color, and cranium size is a testament to the powers attributed to seeing. The gaze is an invitation to differentiate. Love that. Different approaches to comprehending reality then suggest epistemological differences between societies. I'll just read that again. Different approaches to comprehending reality suggests epistemological differences between societies. In other words, when you see that different societies prioritize different ways of learning, those different ways of learning speak to epistemological differences. Relative to Yoruba society, which is the focus of this book, the body has an exaggerated presence in the Western conceptualization of society. And I like this. The term worldview, very natural phrase we use all the time, in my worldview, your worldview, their worldview. In Western world, the term worldview, which is used in the West to sum up the cultural logic of a society, captures the West's privileging of the visual. It is Eurocentric to use it to describe cultures that may privilege other senses. The term world sense is a more inclusive way of describing the conception of the world by different cultural groups. In this study, therefore, worldview will only be applied when describing the Western cultural sense, and world sense will be used when describing the Yoruba or other cultures that may privilege senses other than the visual, or even a combination of senses. So we'll come back to that point in a minute, but that there is a key plank of what she's talking about. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit more when she talks about that a little bit later, because I think that's actually a really important point, which is one of the reasons why this is quite a hard book to read. Because for me, my way of thinking, my ways of thought are thoroughly Western, thoroughly forged in Western concepts, Western philosophical concepts. Concepts of epistemology, ontology, all these kinds of things. You know, I'm a Westerner. There's no dancing around that fact. And so when that point there about the epistemology, how we learn, the West is all about the sight. Other cultures focus on other senses is hard for me to get, but I love it. That's why I love this book. It's just like, boy, you're not going to let me off easy, are you? So then she then goes on to talk about social sciences, and she makes a point that social sciences, you know, that they, on the face of it, in social sciences, on the face of it, she, you know, the West says that social sciences, sorry, are no, we're not about biology. No, we don't root our analysis in biology. What we want to do is understand all of the economic reasons for certain things, the political reasons, historic reasons, the relation, all these kinds of things. So social sciences, in a way, could claim to be not driven by biology, not rooted in biology like other, you know, maybe elements of Western thought are. But Oyewumi argues that even within fields which say they try to not ground their reasoning in biology, the very social categories that they focus on, the very social categories that they are studying and discoursing about, are always presumed to be biological. So on page 5, she says, page 5, Oyewumi says, in the West, social identities are all interpreted through the prism of heritability, to borrow Duster's phrase. Who's Duster? Not sure. Biological determinism is a filter through which all knowledge about a society is run. And she says, I refer to this kind of thinking as body reasoning. It is a biological interpretation of the social world. Biological interpretation of the social world. The point, again, is that as long as social actors like managers, criminals, nurses, and the poor, or Black people or white people or whoever it might be, criminals and so on, as long as they're presented as groups and not as individuals, first of all, and as long as such groups are conceived to be genetically constituted, then there is no escape from biological determinism. So it's not even just a case of, oh, I'm not explicitly talking about biology, so that's fine. You know, our discourse doesn't fit into Oyewumi's kind of characterization. What she's saying is that even if you're just talking about women, the fact of and she's going to make this point later on, one of her main points throughout this chapter and elsewhere is that in the West, gender is, is like seen as like a fundamental, universal social dimension, or whatever you want to call it. And so when critical scholars, for example, are talking about, oh no, well let's feminism or whatever it might be, they're still talking about groups at determined biology, men, women, sexuality is another one. They're still talking about groups determined by biology, gay, straight, queer, whatever. Any of these groups that you're talking about, and she talks about this in some length over the next few pages. I won't quote all of them because goodness me, we'll be here all day if we go into all of the things that she talks about. But she makes the point that even for all of those paradigms, for those forms of discourse which don't explicitly focus on biology, they still are talking about groups that are rooted in biology. So that's a very, 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 very important point. And she talks about, I'm just going to touch on a couple of comments in a sec. She talks about how feminism is no exception, even though feminism has this concept of social constructionism. We'll come back to that in a second. Just want to say shout out to everyone who's on the conversation already. Everything is politics. Peace and blessings to you, family. She said, hi, folks. Still haven't had a chance to finish that brilliant book. Yeah, well, boy. This, well, we're going to go through this hopefully over the next few weeks. And if try and keep up. Next week, we'll do chapter 2, hopefully. And it is a brilliant book. Paul Morris said that point is very crucial with regard to the Western epistemology. I believe it was when you said that. Yeah, it is, and I'm going to come back to that whole point about how the West learns by sight primarily, because she makes a really excellent. There's a section she talks about it, which is just like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant, and then exactly. Tito District said biological determinism is coded into all schools of Western thought, and it's a tough one for me to. The reason it's tough for me to like, okay, a lot of what she's saying, I'm like, wait a sec, wait. Okay, let me just think what she's saying. She's saying because when things are so deep in your own head, in your own mind, then and someone starts to, question some of these things, you're like, wait a minute, but this is reality. This is just what it is, And I'm going to come on to that because when we talk a little bit later, she's going to talk about the ontological ramifications of this stuff. And basically, the way I'm thinking about it is that when your epistemology is a certain way, so focused on sight, and also as a result, focused on sight and also focused on biology, but because when your epistemology prioritizes sight, then you miss out on all different ways of learning, all different ways of perception, but also what you think of as being actually in the world, what you think of as being reality is limited, severely limited, because you only focus on what you can see. So the obvious example of that might be spirituality, if you want to say. If you are so focused on sight and you think that sight is the only way you can really learn stuff, then obviously you're not going to be interested in the invisible. You're not going to be interested in immaterial things. So there we go. Okay, so feminism, and again, shout out to everyone. If you want to become a supporter of this work that we're doing, do go to the Substack, eliwananda.substack.com. All of the live streams I actually upload them onto Substack for supporters, so you can get the full access to the back catalogue. But feminism. So hopefully everybody knows that feminism. One of the well, I'll read it. Let me not just keep repeating myself. So even feminism's social constructionist view of gender is still rooted in biology. And Oyewumi explains this on page 6 when she says, where is it? The idea, oh, hang on. Is it page 6? Maybe it's not page 6. The idea that... All right, I'll just read it from here. The idea that gender is socially constructed, that is, that differences between males and females are to be located in social practices, not in biological facts, was one important insight that emerged early in second-wave feminist scholarship. This finding was understandably taken to be radical in a culture in which difference, particularly gender difference, had always been articulated as natural and therefore biologically determined. Gender as a social construction became the cornerstone of much feminist discourse. The notion was particularly attractive because it was interpreted to mean that gender differences were not ordained by nature. They were mutable and therefore changeable. This, in turn, led to the opposition between social constructionism and biological determinism, as if they were mutually exclusive. So, see, you've heard that I remember I did a training course in one place I used to work at, and that was a gender kind of sensitivity training course 10 years ago or more, maybe. And that was one of the big things. One of the big things of yes, Tito District, that point about the tonality is the thing I'm going to come back to later, because it's just like, I love it. Paradigm shifting. And so, yeah, this training that I did was, let me get rid of that. The training that I did was all about, understanding and sex and gender. Sex is, I was telling people based on how I was trained, sex is here and sex is biological. Sex is, it's just this. It just is what it is. Sex is the biological thing. Gender are the roles that are derived from sex, but these are socially constructed, so it depends, it varies, and so, for example, the idea that women wear pink or girls wear pink and boys wear blue, that's a social construct. It's nothing to do with biology. There's nothing in the biology that says that males are for blue, females are pink. And it sounds, up till fairly recently, I'm like, yeah, that's pretty true, but now I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, okay, it's questioning some of this stuff. What she says, actually, she says that and she values this observation of second wave so-called feminism, Western feminism. She values it because it's, she says, well, yeah, this is needed. It's needed to start to, break down the biological reasoning of Western thought. And so it's good that they did do that. I mean, the same thing applies to race as well. It's good that you have bodies of thought which are attacking the biological determinism of scientific racism. But what she says actually is that where are we? I've got the quote here, but it's not here on my. Oh, here we go. In spite of all efforts, where are we? Okay, I think it's on page 9. This is where she's talking about social orders and biology. But anyway, I've got the quote here. I can't remember what page. Oh, here we go. Page 9. Yeah, page 9. At the bottom of page 9, she says, the way in which conceptual categories, sex and gender, functioned in feminist discourse was based on the assumption that biological and social conceptions could be separated and applied universally. Okay. Thus, sex was presented as the natural category and gender as the social construction of the natural. I just said that. But subsequently, it became apparent that even sex has elements of construction. In many feminist writings thereafter, sex has served as the base and gender as the superstructure. And that's from that base and superstructure, I think, comes from sort of Marxist thought, whereby the base is seen as kind of like economic factors, material economic factors. The superstructure is the culture and all the social roles that kind of come off that. Oyewumi is saying here is that in feminist writings, a lot of them, sex is kind of seen as like the base now, the thing that's like this is the hard thing that's definitely it just is what it is. And then you've got all these social roles which are, amorphous. That's the superstructure built on top of the base. But then she says this, in spite of all efforts to separate the two, the distinction between sex and gender is a red herring. In other words, it's a distraction. It's an unnecessary distraction, diverting away from the real crux of the matter, which is, quote, in Western conceptualization, gender cannot exist without sex, since the body sits squarely at the base of both categories. Makes sense. They even say that themselves. Despite the preeminence of feminist social constructionism, which claims a social deterministic approach to society, biological foundationalism, if not reductionism, is still at the center of gender discourses, just as it is at the center of all discussions of society in the West. So yeah, the point there is kind of going back to that point of even when bodies of Western thought are claiming to be countering or attacking the accepted norms of Western thought, they're not really, because they're still using even gender is still rooted in sex, so it's still based on the body logic or the biologic way of looking at society and focusing on biological, on biology to explain and understand society. So even if you're talking about, these roles are, these roles are not, determined by sex or whatever, it is though, because gender is still based on sex, is her point. And what I've written here, a point here is intersectionalism is a good example, isn't it? Like in this day and age, all these counter hegemonic, that might be they claim to be counter hegemonic, but they're not. And I think Oyewumi might make a point like that as well, using hegemony. You've got all these different identities, and I've got to be careful. I don't want to get, cancelled up in here. But you have all these different identities, but they're all what? What are they? They're all based on what? The body, isn't it? Trans, queer, black, Latinx, whatever it might be. What else is there? All these different things, LGBTQ. I don't try to disparage anybody, but just pointing out that even in this Twitter age of Twitter politics, where you got to have your pronouns. What are my pronouns? Well, and we didn't have gender-specific pronouns. We don't have gender-specific pronouns in many African countries, by the way. But yeah, all these things, it's all still rooted in the body. It's still the biologic. It's still rooted in the key, what's the word? Philosophical precept of Western thought, which is social roles are understood by looking at biology. So then she moves on to two critiques of feminism, two more critiques of feminism. But I'll just go back into the comments here. Tito District said she made a really good point about how Yoruba culture prioritizes hearing because it has a tonal language. We're going to come back to that later because yeah, that was an excellent point on page 14, I believe. And Tito said that's how I understood sex and gender before I read Oyewumi. Then when she said sex was also a social construct, yeah, mind blown. It's like, wait a second. Wow. And it is just like, especially when you're trying to read these things like quickly in between life, and you're just like, you read something like, oh, this is just questioned the entire, a huge plank of my understanding of reality. Anyway, I've got to get back to work. It's kind of hard to like, mull on these things in detail. But abled and disabled as well. All these able, disabled, queer, neurodiverse. We think that we're being so, so wow, look at this, it's so amazing. But and maybe it is, in a lot of ways, that stuff is probably much needed and wonderful. But at the end of the day, it is still, the biologic of Western thought. Now, then she goes into feminism in a little bit more detail here. She makes, as I understand it, and by the way, I'm skipping so much. I'm on page 10 now, and I've only probably really covered about 3 of those pages, but time in it. So she points out, first of all, number one, that there's an inherent contradiction in feminist theory, and this inherent contradiction in feminist theory is kind of opens the door for Oyewumi's book, really. Because what she says is this. She says on page 10, and the contradiction is all about this social constructionism. So we talked about the social constructionist view that gender is socially constructed, but sex isn't. That's the view. But what she says is that, well, if gender is socially constructed, then you would expect gender to behave differently in different parts of the world, because obviously something that's based in society, something that's based in history, culture, and so forth, can't behave in the same way everywhere, because every society has different historical, cultural contexts. So she says, on page 10 that the categorization of women in feminist discourses as a homogeneous bioanatomically determined group, which is always constituted as powerful and victimized, doesn't reflect the fact that gender relations are social relations and therefore historically grounded and culturally bound. If gender is socially constructed and gender cannot behave, if gender is socially constructed, then gender cannot behave in the same way across time and space. Very important. And she says on page 16 as well, she says it the other way around. So on what I've just read, she says that gender being a social construct means that we should not expect to see gender behave in the same way everywhere. And then she says on the flip side is that if different cultures necessarily always construct gender as feminism proposes they do and must, i.e. that everywhere around the world women are always oppressed by men, if that is the case everywhere around the world, then the idea that gender is socially constructed is not sustainable. It can't be a social construct if it behaves the same everywhere around the world. You can't have it both ways. And so what that does, why I say that opens the door to Oyewumi's thesis, is because it opens the door to studying societies on their own terms. Yeah, it opens the door to say, rather than imposing the Western concept of gender onto the rest of the world, what you need to do is to look at these other societies, if you want to, and ask them, well, how do you understand gender? How do you understand the differences between anatomical males and anatomical females, if they even, think that those things exist, which they do. And then you say, okay, do they understand? Do they also say that yes, there's men and women there? That's the big dichotomy is male and female, men, women, social roles, gender roles are based on biology. Is that their view? Is it their view though, or have you just assumed it's their view? She's saying she's going to look at Yoruba culture, I think that's how you say it, and she's going to demonstrate that it's not, basically. And she's basically saying to the feminists, listen, yeah, cool, gender is a social construct. I agree. Let's go and look at this particular society and see how they constructed gender. And let's demonstrate that they did not construct gender in the way that the West constructs gender. That's the first thing. And then the second critique she makes, following on from that, is imposition. And what she's saying here is that what's happened is that I'll read this quote here. I haven't put the page number, I'm so sorry. But the quote says, this debate, of course, developed out of certain problems. Therefore, it is logical that in societies where such problems do not exist, there should be no such debate. But due to imperialism, this debate has been universalized to other cultures, and its immediate effect is to inject Western problems where such issues originally did not exist. And I'm going to, so that's the second critique, is that feminists themselves, as counter-hegemonic, thank you, Tito, as it claims to be, second wave feminism and so forth, they're still imposing this biological reasoning or biologic onto the world. And this has serious implications with regard to the knowledge that is produced relating to these different societies. On page 16, she gives a really good example, which I'm going. She quotes. She says a couple of things. I posted this on a community post on YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed as well. By the way, if you haven't subscribed, just click subscribe and like the video. Tafada, por favor, tafadali. I think that means please in Swahili. She says that where is it now? It's the wrong page number. I'm awfully sorry. But she talks about, I'll read it here. It says, an example is the discovery of what have been labeled third gender or alternative genders in a number of non-Western cultures. The fact that the African woman marriage, the Native American Berdashi, and the South Asian Hijra are presented as gender categories incorporates them into the Western biologic and gendered framework without explication of their own social, cultural histories and constructions. A number of questions are pertinent here. Are these social categories seen as gendered in the cultures in question? From whose perspective are they gendered? And so on and so forth. So what she's saying is that researchers don't bother. These feminist researchers, other researchers as well, but also, certainly includes feminist researchers. They don't even bother to understand how such phenomena are understood in the context in which they emerge. They just go there and say, right, it's all about gender, and let's talk about women and gender and so forth. Tito, you brought up, so Tito District says the example she stated about the Western theorist who was studying the women of the Gar people in Accra. She had preconceptions about gender and ended up studying traders and economic conditions. Yeah, I should probably, you know what? Let me read that because it's quite an interesting one. Here we go. Page 16. This was page 16, and that is on page 16. So this is like a practical example of where the Western biologic has been imposed on a society. She says, how do I get rid of this? All right. She says that feminism. All right. For example, a study of Ga residents of a neighborhood in Accra, Ghana, starts thus, quote. So this is the quote from the study. The quote from the study, let me move that. Yeah. The quote from the study says this. So this is the woman who wrote that actual study on the Accra people, the people of Accra, of the Ga people of Accra. This is what she said. Improving our analysis of women and class formation is necessary to refine our perceptions, unquote. And then Oyewumi says, women? What women? Who qualifies to be a woman? Who qualifies to be women in this cultural setting? And on what bases are they to be identified? These questions are legitimate ones to raise if researchers take the constructedness of social categories seriously and take into account local conceptions of reality. And that thing there about who qualifies to be women in this cultural setting, that again is like, that's kind of head hurting stuff, because for me, right now I'm talking about, not like, oh, when I was dumb and unconscious, years ago. Right now, I'm saying that to ask someone, well, who is considered to be a woman in this context, within that context, who that thought is like, okay, what do you mean? Surely they just look and just say, look, that person there's got breasts and a certain physical shape. This person here has got a beard and no breasts. That's just a man. That's a woman. And then, and what she's saying there actually is deeper than. She's not even just saying that. She's obviously not discounting the fact that there are these obvious anatomical differences between men and women. But what she is saying, or what we call men and women, what she's saying is that the social roles, man and woman here in the West, cannot and do not apply necessarily amongst the Ga society, in the Ga society. They do not necessarily apply in Yoruba society, because they don't necessarily understand that the physical, biological, anatomical differences between men and women then determine their social roles, their roles in society, their positions in society. So it's like, okay, wait. Got to think this very carefully. Now, I'm going to read the quote here from that study again. She says this. She says, Oyewumi says this. She says, the pitfalls of preconceived notions and ethnocentricity become obvious when the author of the study admits, quote, another bias I began with, I was forced to change. Before starting fieldwork, I was not particularly interested in economics, causal or otherwise. Yeah. But by the time I had tried an initial pre-survey with the subjects of the study, I presume, the overweening importance of trading activities in pervading every aspect of women's lives made a consideration of economics imperative. And when the time came to analyze the data in depth, the most cogent explanations often were economic ones. I started out to work with women. I ended up by working with traders, unquote. And then Oyewumi kind of unpacks why is this important? Why is this example important? She says, why in the first place did Claire Robertson, the author of this study, start with women, and what distortions were introduced as a result? What if she had started with traders? Would she have ended up with women? Beginnings are important. This is on page 17. Adding other variables in midstream does not prevent or solve distortions and misapprehensions. Like many studies on Africans, half of Robertson's study seems to have been completed and the categories already put in place before she met the Ga people. Robertson's monograph is not atypical in African studies. In fact, it is one of the better ones, particularly because, unlike many scholars, she is aware of some of her biases. And then again, she goes on to talk about the main bias there is the biologic. She says, the fundamental bias that many Westerners, including Robertson, bring to the study of other societies is body reasoning, the assumption that biology determines social position. Because, quote unquote, women is a body-based category, it tends to be privileged by Western researchers over, quote unquote, traders, which is non-body based. Even when traders are taken, I'll stop there. But that's a good explanation there about what she's talking about, and that's the second big critique she makes against feminism. But also, she's going to now talk about African studies. And they, just like a hammer sees everything as a nail, so these researchers see they see gender everywhere because they've just imposed it. They've detached it from the West, this biological reasoning, taken it overseas and imposed it. They have ontological assumptions, I'd say, i.e. that gender is a universal category. So shout out to, thank you, Tito, for bringing that up. I wasn't going to read that example, but I'm glad I did. And yeah, shout out to you, Diva Tomboyish. What's going on? Good to have you on board. Enough respect, peace and blessings to you. Much love. And then Paul Morris said, this is why we have to understand that gender, first and foremost, is racialized from the get-go. They are inseparable components. Oh, Lord, now you're bringing, now you're bringing, now you're trying to get us deeper and deeper. Look, stop. We just want to stay. No, but yeah, okay. We could come back to that, and I'm sure we will come back to that while we go through this book. Okay, now we go on to African studies. Now she's kind of finished with feminism. She's now going to go into African studies, and she's got a lot to say with regard to African studies. And this has been weird for me, because in my head, I think of African studies as something that's done by Africans for Africans in my head, but because I've not had much experience with African studies in an academic context. But thinking about it, it makes sense. Whenever I've been to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies here down in London, the professors, half the professors are not Africans. You see a lot of people of various different ethnicities, and frankly, even the people who are Africans in there, as Oyewumi is about to make the point now, are basically, it's almost like Eurocentric in blackface. So she says, so having criticized feminism, she now focuses on African studies. She says that African studies is generally just as Westocentric as feminism and any other body of Western academic endeavor. Westocentric is her term to replace Eurocentric, so that it kind of covers North America as well and other parts of the white world, let's say. She basically says that African studies orbits the West, orbits the philosophical foundations of Western thought. African studies it orbits it. So just like we've talked about already, these bodies of thought are all based on categories that are biologically social roles, social categories, social groups, which are seen to be biological, basically. And she says the same thing about African studies. And what she says as well is she talks about how, African studies basically follows after whatever the West is saying. So, for example, years and years, ages and ages ago, it was like, George Hegel, and this German dude, Africa has no history. So, what did African studies do? Folks do. Africa does have history. So we've had lots and lots of studies, and thank you so much for those studies, Sheikh Anta Diop and all these guys. It's great. We need it. But it's basically still, okay, the West has told us this about Africa, so let's disprove that thing that the West has told us. There was a time where, Africa, this idea that Africa had no states. And so you have, lots of ink being spilled to show that we did have states. We had Kush, we had Kemet, we had the Akan states, we had the Baganda people, we had this, we had that, the Zulu, still basically following the lead set by the West. And then more recently, philosophy. Africa has no philosophy, we're told. So African philosophers are like, we do have philosophy, we do. The point is that African studies, Oyewumi argues, is not driven by the philosophical concerns of African people or the specific people in question, but by the philosophical concerns of the West. And she says in that like these bounded disciplines and theories for granted and array themselves around them, for or against doesn't matter. There can be no fundamental difference in scholarship among these practitioners of knowledge, no matter what their points of origin. And this is like, she's just there like, reload. She's basically, and she gives some specific examples. I put a quote here, which is from the Wailers, Bob Marley and the Wailers, Babylon System, the song, when he says, building church and universities, deceiving the people continually, the Babylon system is a vampire. I've always loved that line because it's like, even when I was younger, like, 12, 13 or whatever, and I was like, what the hell? Why does he have but I knew, I'm not sorry, I wasn't questioning it. I was like, yeah, I get it. I get it. Building churches and universities. On the one hand, you think, well, what's wrong with maybe you can understand the church thing, like, oh yeah, they're imposing religion, but universities? This is surely we want universities. But Oyewumi will say that actually, well, I mean, the fact that we are, and we're gonna go back to that point about Yoruba and language. But the point she's making basically is that, as long as even the knowledge production is entrusted to these entities called universities, that in and of itself is a Western construct. The existence of certain universities in places like Timbuktu and so forth, notwithstanding, her point is literally that, as long as knowledge is produced in universities with all of the phenomenology of universities, so funding, ways of, all the different paraphernalia and ways of doing and being that come with universities, bounded disciplines as well is very related. This division of the study of existence into mathematics, science, chemistry, physics, philosophy, economics, She says, as long as we're, encasing ourselves in these categories, then, and the theories, of course, even if we're claiming that we're arguing against them, we're not. She says, Oyewumi argues that there's not going to be any real difference in the scholarship produced, which is great. And that then opens up now. She's now going to kind of, she's kind of on the back straight now in the chapter, and sort of, last part of the chapter now. She's now going to go on to talk about the Yoruba specifically, and this part of the chapter is called "Writing Yoruba into English, Propagating the West." And that title that basically sums it up, doesn't it? That when Yoruba studies on Yoruba people is conducted in English, then what you're really doing is that you're basically doing that imposition that she's railed against. You're going to, no matter whether you like it or not, even if you're writing to support, or what's the word, to elevate Yoruba society and promote it and say how great it is and blah blah blah, you're still propagating Western epistemology, because you're propagating. If you're not dealing with the Yoruba language, then you're not really studying the Yoruba. You're studying English interpretations of Yoruba society. And this matters hugely. She says on page 28 that, where are we? Yeah, it says on page 28, the lack of appreciation, and this is very, very, I want to find it here. I want to read it from the page because here we go. So yeah, she says, against this backdrop, the lack of critical studies on Yoruba language, despite the expansion of the corpus, i.e. despite the fact that there's so much writing on the Yoruba culture, language, people, history, and so forth, and this is in the 1990s. So she's saying there's been so much written, but there's been very, very, very little of it that is about the language of the Yoruba. And she says, this is shocking. She says, this is not a minor problem. The lack of appreciation that language carries with it the world sense of a people has led to the assumption that Western categories are universal. In most studies of the Yoruba, the indigenous categories are not examined but are assimilated into English. This practice has led to serious distortions and quite often to a total misapprehension of Yoruba realities. The implications of this situation are not just semantic. So sorry, just to stop there. So we made that point, it's a very clear point that if you're not even studying the language of a people, knowing that the language of a people contains their world sense or world view, but she's saying the world sense because it's not just about the Western view, but the language contains the philosophy, the all these kinds of things of a people. And this is really challenging for me because I'm not fluent in any African tongue, least of all not my own tribal tongue. And she's saying that if you're not even going to study the language, then you're doomed to distort a society. You're doomed to not be able to overstand that society. But then she says this, which I love. Going back to the ontological kind of thing. She says, the implications of this are not just semantic, however. So it isn't just to do with words, but also it's epistemological in that they have affected the type of knowledge that has been produced and who has done the producing in Yoruba written discourse. A thorough analysis of the language is essential to the construction of knowledge about the Yoruba in English. This has never been done calls into question findings in various disciplines, and this shall be illustrated in subsequent chapters.